Welcome back. This is Dr. Jenkins. Here we are for part 2 of our discussion on the respiratory system. So in the first video, we spent a lot of time talking about the anatomy, and I encourage you to really get the anatomy down. And once you've learned the anatomy, then tackle this physiology, which is what we're going to be talking about now. All right, so here we go. The first part of the physiology that we have to talk about is breathing. And the fancy term for breathing is ventilation. And all that means is, it's what you know. We breathe in, we inhale or breathe in, and then we exhale. And the idea here is we bring air into the lungs to allow oxygen to be diffused into the bloodstream. And then we exhale, we blow out, in order to get rid of CO2 that was accumulated in the bloodstream, transported back to our lungs so we can breathe out. But we know we have to get a little more specific. So stick around, you're going to be able to bear with me. This ability to breathe or ventilate is mechanically all about the volume-pressure relationship. These two are inversely related, which means when one is high, the other is low. When one is low, the other is high. So when volume is high, think about your lungs. When your lung volume is high, when you breathe in, your rib cage expands, so our lung volume is large. Well, when the space is greater, there's less pressure between particles. Versus when I breathe out and my chest cavity gets smaller, then the particles are closer together and the pressure between them is higher. I think about an example of people in an elevator. So the elevator is a volume of space. So if we have an elevator full of 20 people, the elevator is a small volume of space and we have 20 people. So if we all cram into an elevator, when the volume is smaller, the pressure between the people is greater. You're all smushed together, there's more pressure between you. But what if I put those same 20 people in a huge auditorium? Now the volume, the space is bigger, therefore the people spread out, and the pressure between them is lower. And here's what's going to happen. And actually, I think it might be easier if I make a new drawing. Let's talk about it. So let's talk about what's happening to the volume and pressure when we inhale and exhale. All right, here at the top, I'm going to draw a lung. I'm a terrible lung drawer. Let's talk about inhalation. When we breathe in. When we breathe in, our rib cage expands. So now our lung volume gets greater. So we breathe in, and our lung volume goes up. We breathe in, our rib cage expands, the volume goes up. So when we have a higher volume, we have a lower pressure. So the pressure between the gas particles is low. And you see, it's all going to be about comparing the pressure. We're going to compare the pressure inside the lungs to the pressure in the atmosphere. So let's say we're at sea level. If we're at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. So, in order to bring air in, we contract muscles to increase our lung volume. When we increase our lung volume, the pressure inside drops. Once the pressure inside drops below atmospheric pressure, we have a pressure gradient. Outside the body, the pressure is higher. Compared to inside, it's lower. So air is going to flow from high to low pressure. This is how it's done, folks. I'm going to say that again because it's really important. So when we inhale, we contract muscles to increase our lung volume. When we increase our lung volume, that drops the pressure. When the pressure inside the lungs is less than the pressure in the atmosphere, we've generated a pressure gradient. So when you open your mouth, air will move from high to low. Let's talk about exhalation. We have our same lung. It's a terrible lung. Just going to ignore that. Thank you. So during exhalation, excuse me, during exhalation, we want to breathe air out. So basically, we're going to reverse this, which means that we contract muscles to decrease lung volume. Because when you breathe out, you decrease the lung volume. So for a period of time, we decrease volume. And when we decrease the volume, because we know the relationship between pressure and volume, when we decrease volume, the pressure goes up. So if I decrease volume, I'm increasing the pressure. So now, if that same atmospheric pressure exists, 760 millimeters of mercury, now I've actually increased the pressure. So what if the pressure inside is 761 millimeters of mercury? Well, now we have a pressure gradient where now the pressure is higher inside and lower outside. So air will move from your lungs outside. So when we exhale, we contract muscles to lower lung volume, which increases the pressure, creating a pressure gradient where the pressure inside the lungs is higher than the pressure outside the lungs. This is it. And it happens in that order, even though it kind of happens all at once. Really what's happening first is muscles contract to either increase or decrease lung volume. And by decreasing or increasing lung volume, we change the pressure. And we can create pressure gradients. And air will flow from high to low. So let's just see it in another way. This is talking about inhalation. Now we're adding the muscle. So during inhalation, the diaphragm is the muscle that contracts. The diaphragm is a muscle right here, separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity. When the diaphragm contracts, it pushes down. So by pushing down, we're going to expand lung volume. So when the volume goes up, the pressure goes down. So by contracting the diaphragm, it increases the volume of the lungs, which decreases the pressure inside the lungs. So comparatively, let's say we have 760 millimeters of mercury here. And now that we've increased the volume, which has dropped the pressure, we have 759 here. So now air will flow from higher to lower pressure. Flow from higher into lower pressure. Now, you might be looking at this and say, oh, we're going from 760 to 759? It's only 1 unit difference? Well, truth be told, at rest, if we're in resting conditions, that is enough. That is enough to create a pressure gradient and to bring air in. Versus exhalation. When we exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, it pushes back up. And that means the diaphragm comes up like this. So we actually lower the volume, which increases the pressure. Now we've lowered the volume, which increases the pressure. And now if we have the same pressure in the atmosphere, now we might have 761 So now we have a higher pressure in the lungs and a lower pressure here, so air is going to flow out. Air moves from high to low. So pretty much at rest, the diaphragm movement is really all we need. Now, to be sure, in inhalation, the external intercostals are also contracting to lift the rib cage up. So during inhalation at rest, we have contraction of the external intercostals and the diaphragm. But as you can see, I'm only asking you diaphragm. When we exhale at rest, if it's not forced, if we're exhaling at rest, all you have to do is relax the diaphragm. It doesn't take any additional muscle contraction. Excellent. So you should be reviewing this volume-pressure relationship. During inhalation and exhalation, what is the volume and pressure in the atmosphere versus the inside of the lungs? Okay, we can measure a lot of these volumes and capacities. So now that we understand how we bring in and how we breathe out, how we breathe in and breathe out, well, it's possible to quantify volumes of air we can breathe in and out under different circumstances, right? I'd like you to know a couple of these: tidal volume, vital capacity, and residual volume. Let's go to the graph. This might look a little intimidating, but I don't think it's so bad if we spend a little time with it. Let's start with tidal volume. Tidal volume is the amount of air we breathe in and out at rest. Volume of air that we breathe in and out at rest. So it's like a tide. It comes in and out. Just think about as you breathe in and out at rest. It's not a whole lot of volume. You're not exercising. You're not really exerting any additional effort. So your body's very efficient. I'm not going to ask you the amounts. If you're wondering, in an average adult male, our tidal volume is about 500 milliliters per minute of gas, of air. But what I'm pointing out is it's very small. Our body's efficient at rest. And the purpose of that is it gives us much more room to grow. Even though you don't have to know the inspiratory reserve or the expiratory reserve, because our tidal volume is pretty low, we're able to bring in what we need through a pretty low volume. It means that when we need to breathe in forcefully or breathe out forcefully, we have a lot of room to grow, right? I'm not going to ask you those two, but just pointing it out. Let's talk about vital capacity. And what's important about vital capacity is it is your maximal exchangeable air. This is the maximum amount of air you can totally breathe in and breathe out, and it also includes tidal volume. So our vital capacity is actually the maximum amount of air we can breathe in, plus our tidal volume, plus the maximum amount of air we can breathe out. It's the total possible air that you're able to exchange. This will be very dependent upon age, gender, activity level. Someone's an athlete, they're probably going to have a higher vital capacity because they've trained their respiratory muscles more, among other adaptations that happen with exercise. And lastly, I want to point out residual volume. Residual volume, even if you breathe out as hard as you can, there's always going to be a volume of air left in your lungs. And that's what residual volume is. Volume of air always left in the lungs. So even if you forcefully exhale, you're not going to be able to reach that residual volume. And of course, the function here is to keep the lungs inflated. If we were able to totally breathe out every little bit of air, our lungs would deflate. And we don't want that. You don't need to know the specific numbers, 1,200 mils or whatever, but just the definitions. Okay, so now we're going to bring it all together, and I hope these diagrams help you. So if we start from the top, we have to breathe. That's how we bring in oxygen, and that's how we breathe out CO2. So what happens first is ventilation. You will bring in oxygen, goes in, and you'll breathe out CO2. Well, what happens next? Particularly, what happens with the air that we inhale? So we know that we're going to inhale air. It's going to go down our upper respiratory tract, right? Our mouth, pharynx, larynx, to our lower respiratory tract, trachea, and into the lungs, bronchi and bronchioles. So what's going to happen next? Well, we're going to have our first gas exchange. So we've already breathed in the air. It's traveled through the upper and lower respiratory tracts. And now we get to the lungs. Once that breathed in air gets to the lungs, we have a gas exchange called alveolar gas exchange. Which, by the way, shouldn't be surprising that it's called alveolar, because what is the name of the very end of the respiratory tract, those grape-like sacs? Alveoli. We remember that, hold on here, alveolar. Yes. Do I have these later? No. Just bear with me here. I'm trying to make sure I have everything. Okay. In alveolar gas exchange, remember, the lungs are surrounded by blood vessels. So in alveolar gas exchange, it is gas exchange between lungs and blood. Boom. This is the gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Then know how each gas is moving. Oxygen moves from the lungs into the blood. CO2 moves from the blood back into the lungs. So, oxygen moves from lungs, because we just breathed it in, into the blood. Whereas CO2 moves from the blood back into the lungs, because then it can travel back up the respiratory tract and we can breathe it out. This is called alveolar. Sometimes you might see it called external gas exchange. So we had ventilation, where we brought in the air. The air traveled all the way down to the lungs, and we had alveolar gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Then we have to transport that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. And if we remember from our heart chapter, it goes back to the left side of the heart via the pulmonary veins, left atrium, through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then it gets pumped out of the aorta out to the body. So step number 3 would be that the blood travels out to the tissues. And now we have oxygen-rich blood, or oxygenated blood. And then we have, if we put it in order, step 4. Now we have a second gas exchange called systemic, or internal gas exchange. In systemic gas exchange, it's gas exchange between the blood and the tissues. This is the final destination. This was the whole point of bringing in oxygen to begin with, to bring it down to the tissues. So in systemic gas exchange, or gas exchange between the blood and the tissues, oxygen moves, let me go yellow. Oxygen moves from the blood into the tissues. Oxygen moves from the blood into the cells, into the tissues. versus CO2, which built up in the tissues. CO2 moves from the tissues back into the blood because we want to transport that blood that is CO2 rich back to the heart to be pumped to the lungs so we can exhale it out. So in this example, oxygen moves from blood into the tissues, and go back to green, and our CO2 moves from the tissues back into the blood. All of this should make sense, but if you don't study it all the gases and the direction and what the gas exchange is called, it can kind of stumble you a little bit. So you're going to have to spend time with this. And that's why I put this together, to try and give it to you in order. If we were to follow one little oxygen molecule, first we have to bring it into our body through ventilation. Then that oxygen-rich air travels down our respiratory tract to our lungs, where we have alveolar gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Oxygen that we just breathed in moves from the lungs to the blood. On the other hand, carbon dioxide, which has accumulated in the blood, travels from the blood into the lungs to be breathed out. If we follow oxygen, it just got exchanged via via alveolar gas exchange from the lungs into the blood. Then that blood gets pumped back to the heart, where it's pumped out to the body. Once that oxygen-rich blood arrives at its final destination, somewhere in the tissues, then we have our last gas exchange, called systemic gas exchange, where oxygen moves from the blood into the tissues, and carbon dioxide will move from the tissues where it accumulated back into the blood, so that CO2 can be sent back to the heart, go back to the lungs, and we can breathe it out. Who knew it was so much fun, the respiratory system? I knew. Now, we couldn't have a discussion of one of our body systems without discussing regulation. It's all well and good to have this efficient, low tidal volume, a lower respiratory rate at rest. But what happens when we need to increase it? Right? What happens when you're sleeping and you can afford to decrease it a little bit? So what is controlling our respiratory system? Well, of course, one major controller is our nervous system. And I want to point out a couple of things here. The brainstem, specifically the medulla. The medulla contains our primary respiratory control center. Now, other parts of the brain are going to also help. The pons plays a role as well, which is right above the medulla. But the medulla is our primary regulator of breathing. The medulla is able to react only because it's getting feedback from the body. And that's how it always has to be. We have receptors everywhere that are sending information constantly back up to the brain. So the medulla is constantly receiving this information from the brain about oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels. And in particular, the specific type of receptor in the periphery that's doing that for us is an example of a chemoreceptor. So in our organs, everywhere, we have examples of chemoreceptors around our heart. And the chemoreceptors constantly monitor for gas levels. And if all of a sudden there's a drop in oxygen, well, the chemoreceptors are going to communicate that drop in oxygen to the brain, to the medulla. And the medulla gets that information. Holy cow, low in oxygen. And the medulla will then create a response. The medulla will tell the brain to send nerve impulses to the breathing muscles to contract more, to bring in more air, to breathe out more air. And it will also work with the heart to increase heart rate. but the medulla. The medulla controls breathing mostly, with the constant responses from chemoreceptors all throughout the body. Make sure you can give a basic example. One really common example is when carbon dioxide levels rise. And we already know when CO2 is too high, the blood becomes acidic. Chemoreceptors sense this and tell the brain. The brain responds by increasing respiratory rate. When CO2 accumulates, we've got to increase respiratory rate to get rid of more of it. I do want to talk about some disorders. And in my previous work with individuals who are EMTs or paramedics, I hear, and please correct me if I'm wrong, send me an email or whatever, I hear that a lot of the calls people go on that are on an ambulance crew are respiratory in nature. Whether the direct cause is respiratory or their respiratory problem is a symptom of something else. But this is something that you're going to see a lot of. And what's good, even though there can be a lot of problems with our respiratory system, we're pretty much able to break down dysfunction into two potential disorders or two potential reasons. Our respiratory system, when there's a problem, it's usually either from something that's restrictive or something that's obstructive. And of course, identifying what the cause is helps healthcare practitioners to know specifically how best to treat it. A restrictive disorder is any kind of disorder or problem where the lungs are not able to expand and recoil properly. The fancy word for this is compliance. But we want the lungs to be, for lack of a better word, flexible. We want the lungs to be able to expand so they can take in air. And when we breathe out, we want the lungs to be able to recoil back to their original shape. So we want compliant, flexible lungs, nice and spongy. They can increase in size easily, and they can decrease in size easily. Well, any kind of condition that affects the lung's ability to expand and recoil is considered restrictive. One of the examples of a restrictive disorder is pulmonary fibrosis, and I'd like you to know that as an example. In a pulmonary fibrosis type situation, certain areas of the lung tissue become fibrotic, and instead of the lung tissue being soft and pliable, it is hard and fibrotic and kind of crusty, and it means that that particular lung tissue is no longer able to expand and recoil. And if we can't expand and recoil the alveoli, we're not going to be able to exchange gases as well. Those alveoli that are hardened are just going to be out of commission. On the other hand, we have an obstructive disorder, which, as the name suggests, there's something obstructing the airway. There's something obstructing or blocking the airway. So it's not an issue with the lungs themselves and the lung tissue's ability to expand and recoil. This is more a problem of a blockage or some sort of obstruction along the respiratory tract. COPD and asthma are examples of this. Look at COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. When we have over time, we have chronic swelling and narrowing of our respiratory tract. And if we don't have as much air being able to get down our respiratory tract, well, then we can't exchange as much gas in the lungs. So it decreases our ability to bring air in and out. And asthma is a result of chronic inflammation that narrows the airway. Good stuff. You don't have to know these, but as an EMT or paramedic potentially, I thought this might be helpful. These two different types of issues tend to have some differences in the symptoms they present as and signs they present as. Whenever you see wheezing, we're going to think about an obstructive. The airway is narrowed. You got to work harder to try and pump that air out. Okay, the last topic is terminology. And to be honest, there's a ton of terminology in respiratory, but we're just going to cover a couple. And I want to choose some that might be applicable to you. So if we have some sort of trauma, we might see a hemo or pneumothorax. I can't talk today. These are both things that can collapse a lung. So if we look in this x-ray, we can see the left lung is absolutely collapsed because the left lung should make up all that space, but instead, something has interrupted the pleura. Do you remember? The lung is covered by a visceral pleura, which is a covering of connective tissue that clings directly to the lungs. And then we also have a parietal pleura, an outer covering that clings to the chest wall. In between it is a space. And we want the inside of the lungs to be at a higher pressure relative to the intrapleural space. Well, if something interrupts this pleura, think about a stab wound. We just had Halloween a little bit ago. Well, it's like a balloon, folks. We want the lungs to be inflated all the time, remember? Even if you breathe out forcefully, we still have that residual volume. So we want the lungs to be inflated, like an inflated balloon, all the time. Well, the lungs can collapse if we have something disrupting that pleural membrane. It could be from a stab wound, literally. It could be from a rib fracturing and a piece of that rib nicking the pleura and collapsing it. It could be from some sort of chronic illness or infection, chronic pneumonia. There's just so much inflammation that the lung eventually collapses. Typically, we have two main types, a pneumothorax or a hemothorax. In a pneumothorax, because pneumo means air, in a pneumothorax, air is introduced into the lung that causes it to collapse. Hemothorax is when there's blood that leaks into the lung and can cause it to collapse. Air, blood. And I've just circled a couple of these. I'd like you to know hypercapnia, hypoxia, and dyspnea. It's kind of hard to say. Hypercapnia is when there's an elevated level of CO2 in the blood. Bad situation. In fact, only a 10% rise in our partial pressure of CO2, only a 10% rise in carbon dioxide can lead to a doubling of our respiratory rate, because that's how acidic carbon dioxide can be. Hypoxia is when there's a lower than normal level of oxygen in the blood. And then dyspnea is anytime there's some kind of labored breathing, an abnormal breathing where the person is laboring more than they should be. Dyspnea. There you go, folks. Very brief because there's so much more we could talk about, but those are the basics. Well done.